Hello and welcome to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-fi stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our dedicated team can cover their living expenses and continue bringing you great content. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link in the description or the comment section below. November in Wyoming was not a month for the fragile. The temperature hovered well below 0 degrees, and the air held the metallic taste of a looming blizzard. To a rational human being, it was a frozen nightmare. But to the thousands of hunters flooding the rugged timberlines with thermoses of sludge, thick black coffee, and high-caliber ballistic rifles, it was perfect weather. Bodie Beck belonged to the latter group, though he operated in a completely different league. As an independent survival hunting guide, Bodie despised overpriced corporate tactical gear. Instead, he possessed a terrifying knack for cannibalizing cheap civilian electronics. He could wire a $40 plastic drone, a discount thermal sensor, and a generic motion trail camera together to create a localized tracking network that rivaled military-grade surveillance. Right now, however, all of that brilliant redneck engineering was sitting idle on a wind-battered strategic ridgeline. Bodie exhaled a thick cloud of white vapor and muttered a bitter curse into the freezing wind. Spineless city boys. His very important clients, a group of wealthy executives from a much warmer southern state, had canceled their guided elk hunt at the absolute last minute. They claimed the sudden temperature drop to -15 degrees was a severe safety hazard. Bodie just called it pure cowardice. Their abrupt absence left him stranded alone on the high peak, surrounded by enough customized tracking equipment and high-energy rations to supply a small infantry platoon for a solid week. He kicked a frozen snowbank in frustration, adjusting the heavy, insulated collar of his jacket. He was debating whether he should pack up all his gear and head down to the local diner, or just shoot a massive bull elk himself to make the freezing trip worthwhile. Then, the very fabric of the air broke. There was no blinding flash of light tearing through the dense gray clouds overhead. There was no thunderous sonic boom echoing off the steep canyon walls. It was just a violent, immediate collapse of atmospheric pressure. The shift was so sudden and intense that Bodie felt his eardrums pop sharply. The icy wind simply died. A massive flock of mountain crows resting in the pine trees below suddenly erupted into a frantic, chaotic flight, their dark wings beating desperately against an unseen, oppressive weight in the sky. Down in the deep valley basin below the ridge, the Kael'thos mining fleet made their silent planetfall. They were an expansionist species whose entire military doctrine rested on absolute stealth and overwhelming technological superiority. Their massive harvesting vessels and heavily armored infantry utilized sophisticated optical camouflage that perfectly bent ambient light and completely absorbed all internal thermal emissions. To the Kael'thos command structure, they were literal ghosts. They moved through the snowy forest with the supreme arrogance of a highly advanced race, utterly convinced of their absolute invisibility to the primitive, underdeveloped bipedal mammals inhabiting this frozen dirt ball. Why on earth would they fear indigenous creatures that still propelled metal slugs using primitive chemical explosions? But the brilliant minds of the Kael'thos Empire had made a catastrophic environmental miscalculation. Their multi-billion credit cloaking technology, indeed, rendered them entirely transparent to the naked visual spectrum. However, by absorbing all internal heat to prevent any standard infrared detection, their exterior suits effectively operated at absolute zero. In the freezing, snow-covered wilderness of Wyoming, a walking void of absolute zero was a glaring, massive anomaly. Bodie rubbed his aching ears, frowning at the sudden unnatural silence of the forest, thinking some rival outfitter was flying a heavy drone nearby to spook his game. He reached into his heavy parka and raised his cheap internet bought forward-looking infrared binoculars to scan the dark tree line. He expected to see nothing but the faint, warm heat signatures of fleeing mule deer or perhaps a wandering black bear. Instead, he saw them. Against the ambient blue cold of the snowy background, the absolute zero temperature of the Kael'thos camouflage reacted wildly with the rudimentary sensor software. Through the cheap thermal lenses, the highly advanced, totally invisible alien scouts lit up his viewing screen like dozens of glowing, neon green light bulbs marching confidently through the timber. Inside the hovering command vessel, Fleet Commander Xylock stood before the grand observation window, his upper mandibles clicking in supreme satisfaction. The pristine, snow-choked valley below lay completely defenseless. To his highly evolved ocular receptors, his vanguard troops were successfully deployed, moving outward in a flawless, synchronized grid pattern. Engage total harvest protocols, Xylock commanded his bridge officers, his voice a series of wet clicks translated by ship systems. Gather every ounce of organic material in this sector. Do not concern yourselves with the native fauna or the bipedal inhabitants. Our optical and thermal nullification fields are absolute. To them, we are less than the wind. We are invincible. He was entirely unaware that his invincible, undetectable army was currently lighting up the screens of dozens of heavily armed locals, like a parade of radioactive glowworms. Up on the ridge, Bodhi Beck lowered his cheap binoculars and grabbed his battered handheld radio. He clicked the dial to the universal emergency frequency, shared by all the local outfitters and guides. "Hey, listen up, you stubborn old mules," Bodhi spoke into the receiver, keeping his voice hushed but dripping with irritation. "This is Bodhi over on the West Ridge. We have a massive problem, and it is not the weather. Some rival corporate outfitter from out of state is trying to flush our game. They are running some kind of ridiculous, high-tech active camouflage suits or military-grade stealth drones. I am looking at about 40 of them marching right through the main valley basin. They are freezing cold, lighting up neon green on the cheap thermal gear. Check your scopes." Across 5 different heavily wooded slopes, a chorus of annoyed grumbles, static clicks, and zippers opening echoed through the freezing air. Dozens of seasoned hunters, clad in heavy blaze orange and thick wool, raised their incredibly expensive rifles. They flipped down their state-of-the-art thermal imaging scopes, equipment that cost more than their pickup trucks. Just as Bodhi had warned, the dark, snow-covered timberline was absolutely swarming with glowing green humanoid figures. However, instead of feeling the primal dread one might expect when encountering an unknown, technologically superior extraterrestrial force, the hunters of Wyoming felt only one thing: absolute, unadulterated rage. To these men and women, this was not an alien invasion. This was a bunch of arrogant, rich city tourists stomping right through their carefully scouted territory. "Are you kidding me right now?" A deep, gravelly voice crackled back over Bodhi's radio. It was Old Man Miller, a veteran who had been sitting in the same tree stand since 4 o'clock in the morning. "I paid $2,500 for this specific tag, and these clowns are crunching through the snow right under my firing lane. I am going to have a very impolite conversation with whoever is running this circus." Down in the thickest part of the pine forest, Kael'thos Scout Subunit 7 was feeling extremely confident. His orders were to catalog local machinery. He confidently approached a primitive, 4-wheeled open-air transport vehicle parked near the base of a massive pine tree. It was an old, mud-covered all-terrain vehicle. The scout began running a scanning beam over the frozen tires, completely ignoring the heavy, crunching sounds his armored boots were making in the deep snow. Why would he worry? He was a phantom. Directly 30 feet above him, strapped into a metal tree stand, a hunter named Earl was losing his mind. Earl had been tracking a specific, legendary herd for 6 days. Now, He could hear some idiot clomping around in the snow directly below his boots, breathing heavily, and scaring off any animal within a 5-mile radius. Earl leaned over the edge of his metal platform, trying to see through the thick pine needles. He held a massive, stainless steel thermos in his right hand, the lid unscrewed, completely full of boiling hot, incredibly bitter black coffee. "Hey, idiot!" Earl barked down into the empty-looking clearing. "Get away from my four-wheeler before I come down there and make you regret waking up today." The alien scout froze. The bipedal creature was speaking. It could not possibly be speaking to him. He was cloaked. The scout took another heavy, crunching step forward to inspect the vehicle's engine block. Up in the tree, Earl shifted his weight in a furious huff. His heavy winter boot slipped on the icy metal grate of the stand. He flailed his arms to catch his balance. In the process, the heavy thermos flipped entirely upside down. A full quart of scalding, 200-degree black coffee plummeted through the freezing air. It landed squarely on the invisible, absolute zero helmet of the Kelthos scout. The resulting thermal shock was violently instantaneous. The boiling liquid hit the freezing energy barrier, creating a massive cloud of hissing steam. The scout's billion-credit camouflage system shrieked in mechanical agony. Bright blue electrical sparks violently erupted across the alien's shoulders. The camouflage completely collapsed. Earl stared down in sheer disbelief. Where there had been empty snow a second ago, there was now a 7-foot-tall, heavily armored reptilian creature, desperately swatting at its short-circuiting helmet while smelling strongly of burnt electronics and dark roast coffee. The scout, absolutely terrified that its divine cloak had been breached by a weaponized stream of boiling black acid, panicked entirely. It unholstered its heavy plasma caster, aiming blindly toward the tree line, and squeezed the firing mechanism. A blinding beam of superheated purple plasma roared across the clearing. It missed Earl completely. It missed the tree completely. Instead, it tore straight across the valley and struck a magnificent 1,000-pound, 12-point bull elk perfectly in the chest. This was the exact legendary beast that 3 different hunting parties, including Earl and Bodie, had been patiently tracking for 168 straight hours. The majestic creature was vaporized instantly into a fine mist of hot ash and glowing embers. For exactly 5 seconds, a heavy, dead silence fell over the entire valley. The snow stopped crunching. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, the radio clipped on Bodie's shoulder exploded into a cacophony of absolute fury. The unspoken rules of the wilderness had been violently broken. The ultimate prize had been destroyed. The Kelthos Empire thought they were invading a primitive, helpless world. They had no idea they had just declared war on the most heavily armed, easily irritated demographic on the planet during the holiest week of their year. Fleet Commander Xylox stared at the tactical feed in absolute horror. One of his elite vanguard units had just been forcefully uncloaked by what his telemetry sensors analyzed as a highly corrosive, boiling organic acid weapon. The bipedal natives were not helpless. They possessed thermal liquid artillery. Panic rippled through the pristine command deck. "Commander, our localized stealth grids are being compromised across the entire sector." A subordinate clicked frantically, his mandibles trembling. "The locals are highly aware of our presence." Xylox bared his sharp fangs, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "They dare challenge the absolute might of the Kelthos Empire with primitive chemical burns, initiate the orbital sonic pacifier, calibrate the frequency to paralyze the central nervous system of every mammalian lifeform within a 50-mile radius. We will flatten their primitive neural pathways and collect their dormant, helpless bodies." High above the planetary atmosphere, the massive command ship charged its primary crowd control battery. A localized, invisible wave of concentrated sonic energy blasted downward, slamming heavily into the Wyoming Valley. To a biologically unprotected mammal, this highly specific frequency was engineered to instantly sever the brain's connection to the motor cortex, dropping the victim into a state of frozen, helpless agony. However, Zylock lacked one crucial piece of cultural data regarding human hunters operating in sub-zero temperatures. They were universally terrified of losing their hearing to high-caliber rifle fire, and they absolutely hated having cold ears. Up on the steep ridges, dozens of angry humans were wearing thick, heavily insulated wool beanies. Over those beanies, they wore expensive, battery-powered active noise-canceling earmuffs designed specifically to block out loud, damaging acoustic frequencies while amplifying quiet footsteps. When the devastating alien neurosonic wave hit the mountainside, Bodie Beck merely felt a slight static pop in his electronic headset. He tapped the hard plastic casing with a thickly gloved finger, assuming the freezing weather was killing his batteries. Around the valley, the other heavily armed hunters experienced nothing more than a faint, annoying hum that sounded like a distant, lazy mosquito. Not a single human collapsed. Not a single weapon was dropped. But while the orbital sonic weapon failed spectacularly against the insulated humans, it had a profoundly catastrophic effect on the local wildlife. The frequency Zylock chose for neural paralysis was a highly specific acoustic vibration. In an incredibly unfortunate stroke of cosmic coincidence, this exact frequency perfectly replicated two distinct sounds native to the North American wilderness. The primary harmonic mirrored the deafening, deeply aggressive mating bugle of an incredibly dominant bull elk. The secondary undertone matched the territorial, bone-rattling roar of an enraged grizzly bear. It was late November. This was the absolute peak of the rutting season. The thick pine forests were packed with thousands of testosterone-fueled, hyper-aggressive, massive beasts desperately looking for a violent fight to prove their dominance. When the alien sonic wave echoed through the dark timber, it did not paralyze them. It insulted them. It was a biological challenge broadcasted directly into the ears of every alpha predator and territorial herbivore for 50 miles. Deep in the woods, the frozen ground began to tremble. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration beneath the heavy snow, quickly escalating into an ear-splitting, thunderous roar of snapping branches and pounding hooves. The Kelthos infantry, still trying to secure the perimeter after the boiling coffee incident, braced their glowing energy rifles, fully expecting a coordinated human military assault. Instead, the tree line exploded. A massive tidal wave of pure, unfiltered wilderness fury poured into the valley. Hundreds of enraged bull elk, each weighing over 1,000 pounds and sporting razor-sharp, heavily branched antlers, charged out of the woods with pure murder in their black eyes. They were quickly joined by furiously charging moose and massive, deeply agitated grizzly bears awakened from their early winter lethargy. The alien vanguard stood absolutely no chance. Energy weapons discharged wildly, melting snow and vaporizing tree bark. But the sheer kinetic mass of the biological stampede was completely unstoppable. Heavily armored Kelthos soldiers were violently launched high into the freezing air by swinging antlers. Elite alien scouts were trampled deep into the freezing mud beneath thousands of heavy hooves. The highly trained, technologically supreme invasion force was instantly reduced to a chaotic, screaming mess of routing infantry desperately trying to outrun enraged livestock. Bodie Beck watched the magnificent carnage unfold through his thermal lenses, a slow, wicked grin spreading across his wind-chapped face. The valley floor was a swirling vortex of glowing green alien heat signatures, desperately fleeing from the massive, furious red blooms of the charging animals. Seeing a brilliant opportunity to escalate the chaos, Bodie dropped his binoculars and scrambled toward his heavy equipment bags. He grabbed a modified heavy payload drone, a cheap plastic quadcopter he had originally rigged to carry emergency medical supplies across steep ravines. Next, he pulled out 3 thick plastic bladders filled with a highly concentrated, incredibly pungent liquid he normally used to mask his human scent. It was a potent, gag-inducing mixture of synthetic wolf urine and dominant bear pheromones. Bodhi quickly strapped the stinking payload to the drone's undercarriage, powered up his modified remote controller, and launched the buzzing machine off the snowy cliff. He steered the nimble craft directly over the center of the valley, positioning it right above the hastily erected, glowing energy barricades of the Kelthos forward operating base. He waited patiently until the drone hovered perfectly over the largest cluster of retreating alien commanders. Then flicked the manual release switch. The 3 plastic bladders plummeted downward, exploding violently against the hard light shields and spraying the incredibly foul, territorial marking scent all over the alien troops and their pristine communication equipment. Down below, the charging beasts caught the fresh, overwhelming scent of their absolute worst natural enemies. The pheromones acted like a biological, laser-guided targeting system. The stampeding herd immediately changed direction, abandoning the scattered foot soldiers and converging entirely on the Kelthos command center. Bears roared furiously, tearing their massive claws at the energy shields, while massive elk repeatedly rammed their hardened, bony skulls against the alien metal structures. Up on the strategic firing lines, the heavily armed locals slowly realized they no longer needed to participate in the physical defense of their planet. The sheer anger over the vaporized prize animal shifted rapidly into pure, deeply satisfying amusement. Rifles were lowered, thermal scopes were clicked off, radios crackled with loud, booming laughter echoing across the peaks. Old Man Miller, who just minutes ago was ready to declare an intergalactic war, leaned back heavily against his freezing pine tree and unzipped a side pocket on his heavy hunting jacket. He pulled out a large, thick strip of peppered beef jerky and took a slow, deliberate bite. "Well, I will be absolutely damned." Miller chuckled over the open emergency radio channel, chewing loudly into the microphone. "Bodhi, are you seeing this absolute circus down by the creek?" Bodhi leaned comfortably against his stacked gear crates, popping open a dented silver thermos of hot apple cider. "I am watching it in high-definition thermal." Miller. "They are climbing the pine trees, I repeat. The glowing green space invaders are currently scrambling up the pine branches to get away from a herd of very angry moose." The humans sat comfortably on their freezing, snow-covered thrones, utterly relaxed, sharing preserved snacks and swapping crude jokes over the radio waves. They casually watched the highly advanced, terrifying conquerors of the stars run for their absolute lives, completely dismantled by nothing more than the terrifying, untamed biology of a Wyoming winter. Deep within the battered command vessel, Fleet Commander Zylock seethed with absolute humiliation. His elite vanguard had been utterly disgraced by a herd of mindless biological beasts. He could not afford another humiliating setback. Slapping a heavily scaled hand across the main console, he initiated the absolute lockdown protocol. "Activate the Omega Shield," Zylock ordered, his voice echoing through the damaged bridge. "Seal the entire perimeter." A deafening hum vibrated through the bedrock of the valley. From the central spire of the Kelthos mothership, a blinding pulse of raw plasma energy erupted outward. It expanded into a massive, translucent dome of shimmering violet light, completely enclosing the vessel and the surrounding mining excavation site. The sheer force of the expanding energy barrier violently pushed away the remaining wildlife, uprooted massive pine trees, and vaporized boulders that stood in its path. By the time the county sheriff and the local volunteer civil defense militia finally navigated the treacherous mountain roads and arrived at the valley ridge, the alien fortress was fully established. Sheriff Davis, a man who had spent 30 years dealing with nothing more dangerous than drunk drivers and the occasional poacher, stared down at the glowing cosmic dome in sheer disbelief. However, he was not a man to back down from unauthorized trespassing in his county. "All right, let us test the structural integrity of that glowing bubble," Sheriff Davis commanded, gesturing to his heavily armed deputies and the gathered hunters. They unleashed an absolute torrent of firepower. Heavy hunting rifles, armor-piercing rounds from the local SWAT vehicle, and even a few sticks of surplus industrial mining dynamite were hurled down into the valley. It was entirely useless. The Omega Shield was an engineering marvel of kinetic displacement. The moment a high-velocity bullet struck the violet barrier, the shield instantly absorbed the kinetic energy and violently reflected it back as a shockwave. The dynamite explosions were swallowed whole, the concussive force effortlessly deflected into the sky. Suddenly, the violent cracking of rifle fire was drowned out by a deafening, synthesized voice broadcasting across every open radio frequency in the county. It was Zylock, broadcasting his absolute victory from the safety of his impregnable fortress. "Oh, citizens of this primitive rock," the alien commander gloated, his translated voice dripping with bureaucratic arrogance. "Your pathetic kinetic weapons are absolutely useless against the Omega Shield. You have no scientific capacity to breach a cosmic-level energy barrier. In exactly 12 hours, our deep crust harvesters will completely drain the geothermal core of your region. Your land will freeze into a dead husk, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the gathered locals. The bravado of the earlier skirmish completely evaporated. Sheriff Davis lowered his radio, his face grim under the flashing red and blue lights of his cruiser. The hunters, men who prided themselves on overcoming any physical obstacle the wilderness threw at them, realized they were facing a literal dead end. All the firepower on Earth meant nothing if they could not even scratch the paint on the enemy's front door. While the crowd argued loudly over the impossible situation, Bodie Beck stepped away from the chaotic command post. He walked to the edge of the snowy cliff, pulling his heavy jacket tight against the freezing wind. He did not look at the shield as an impenetrable magical barrier. He looked at it as a physical object interacting with a harsh environment. He narrowed his eyes, observing a gentle flurry of fresh snow drifting down from the dark clouds. When the tiny, freezing snowflakes hit the glowing violet surface of the Omega Shield, they did not violently ricochet away like the rifle bullets. They did not trigger a massive flash of kinetic absorption. Instead, the snowflakes gently landed on the energy barrier. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the snow began to slide down the curved side of the dome, melting slightly against the ambient radiation to form a massive, continuous puddle of freezing water at the base of the shield. Bodie felt a sudden, sharp thrill of realization. The physics of the situation suddenly clicked into place. The Kael'thas engineers had designed the ultimate defense against modern warfare. The Omega Shield was programmed with a hyperactive reactive sensor. It was built to instantly intercept and block objects traveling at extremely high speeds, like ballistic missiles or laser fire, and to repel massive spikes in thermal energy. But it had a fatal, glaring blind spot. It was completely blind to objects that possessed absolutely zero thermal energy and moved at a slow, creeping velocity. The highly advanced cosmic shield did not register the slowly falling, freezing snow as a threat. It treated the cold, slow-moving mass as background environmental noise. Bodhi smiled, looking up from the shield to the massive, heavily snow-laden mountain peak directly above the alien vessel. Pure strength and high-speed ballistics were utterly useless here. But slow, crushing, freezing mass was a completely different story. Bodhi marched directly over to Sheriff Davis, cutting right through the chaotic crowd of deeply frustrated hunters. He tapped the freezing metal hood of the police cruiser to get the man's attention. "Sheriff, tell your dispatchers to immediately cancel that emergency request for the National Guard," Bodhi stated, his tone deadpan and strictly business. "Bringing in more heavy artillery and military jets is a complete waste of time. I just spent the last 10 minutes watching the fresh snowfall interacting with that energy dome. The alien system is engineered to flawlessly deflect high-velocity ballistics and repel massive thermal spikes. But it has a glaring, fatal design flaw. It completely ignores ambient environmental elements. It is totally blind to cold, slow-moving mass. If we drop a few million tons of freezing weight on top of it, the kinetic sensors will not even trigger to push back until the roof has already caved in. We do not shoot through this thing. We crush it. Sheriff Davis stared at the hunting guide for exactly 3 seconds. The seasoned lawman was a lifelong Wyoming native. He instinctively understood the devastating, quiet geometry of a snow-laden mountain peak far better than anyone else. "All right," Davis nodded sharply, reaching for his police radio. "What exactly do you need?" Within 15 minutes, the entire tactical approach of the community shifted completely. The heavy, expensive hunting rifles were quietly unloaded and zipped back into their padded cases. The high-capacity magazines were stowed away in truck cabins. Instead of relying on traditional military firepower, the local mountain community mobilized their true, everyday heavy hitters. Cell phones buzzed urgently across the county lines. Operators from the local ski resort situated on the adjacent mountain range immediately threw their heavy utility trucks into gear. A massive, rumbling convoy of county snowplows, yellow earth movers, and heavy-duty pickup trucks hauling crates of commercial avalanche control explosives began crawling up the steep, treacherous logging roads. It was a perfectly synchronized, eerily silent operation executed by people who spent their entire lives battling the brutal winter. Down in the bottom of the valley, Fleet Commander Zylock observed the sudden cessation of hostilities through his glowing thermal viewing screens. The primitive, bipedal creatures had completely stopped their completely useless ballistic assault. Instead of bringing larger weapons down the hill, the humans were actively packing their primitive canvas bags, turning their backs on the glorious Kelthos mothership, and aggressively hiking straight up the impossibly steep, snow-covered summit looming directly above the valley floor. Zylock let out a wet, guttural laugh that echoed loudly across the pristine command bridge. "Look at them!" the alien commander sneered, gesturing grandly toward the main monitors. "Their primitive morale is completely broken. They finally realize the absolute futility of their violent resistance against our supreme technology. They are completely abandoning their ancestral hunting grounds and fleeing up into the frozen rocks to hide like frightened rodents." He turned his back on the viewing screens in absolute disgust. "Let them freeze to death in the dark, maintain the shield perimeter, and begin the planetary geothermal extraction process in exactly 2 hours." High above the glowing violet dome, the harsh, biting wind whipped fiercely against Bodhi as he knelt near the jagged edge of the upper cliff face. He used his thick gloves to brush away a heavy layer of fresh powder, exposing the deep, violently compacted layers of old ice beneath. He was silently calculating geological fracture angles. The early winter storms had dumped a historic, unprecedented amount of precipitation on this specific slope. There was a gargantuan, highly unstable slab of heavy, wet snow resting precariously on a dangerously slick layer of bottom ice. It was millions of tons of frozen water, a massive structural failure, just waiting for a single, well-placed trigger point to let gravity take over. "We have a massive load-bearing weakness running horizontally right across this main ridgeline," Bodhi instructed over the secure radio channel, directing the arriving ski resort patrol teams. "I need you to plant the explosive charges exactly every 50 feet. I want a sharp V formation pointing directly down the throat of that canyon." The local hunters, men and women who navigated dangerous alpine terrain purely for sport, moved efficiently like a seasoned tactical demolition unit. They drilled deep, precise holes into the hard ice shelf, carefully lowering the heavy cylindrical avalanche charges deep into the weak snowpack. They wired the entire extensive network together, ensuring the blast sequence would not just shatter the ice, but specifically funnel the resulting colossal flow precisely toward the center of the valley basin, where the alien vessel sat glowing in the dark. With the explosive charges fully armed and set, the entire local workforce retreated carefully over the backside of the summit, putting a solid, impenetrable wall of granite between themselves and the impending blast zone. Bodhi stood completely alone on a safe, adjacent, rocky outcropping. He held the heavy plastic detonator box securely in his thickly gloved left hand. The freezing wind howled loudly through the dark canyon, carrying the faint, arrogant hum of the alien shield generator. Bodhi looked down at the bright violet dome currently polluting his absolute favorite hunting grounds. He casually thumbed the safety switch off. "Well, boys," Bodhi whispered out loud to the empty, freezing air, a slow, cynical smile spreading across his wind-chapped face. "Looks like hell really is freezing over." He firmly pressed the red button. The entire ridge violently shuddered beneath their boots. It was not a fiery, explosive display of traditional military might, but a deep, agonizing structural severing of the earth itself. The precisely placed charges detonated simultaneously, their concussive force slicing cleanly through the weak base layer of the snowpack across the entire width of the upper mountain. For a brief, terrifying second, the massive peak seemed to hold its breath. Then, gravity reclaimed its absolute authority. Millions of tons of compacted ice, heavy winter powder, and loose granite boulders detached from the bedrock. A mega avalanche was born. It surged down the steep canyon walls with the terrifying, majestic power of a frozen white tsunami. It consumed entire acres of pine trees, snapping century-old trunks like dry twigs, gathering impossible mass and unstoppable momentum as it roared toward the valley floor. The sound was deafening, a continuous, thunderous roar that physically shook the air. Yet, as the colossal wave of white death reached the bottom and approached the glowing alien fortress, the leading edge began to pile up and compress. It acted like a creeping, infinitely heavy liquid, rather than a high-velocity ballistic projectile. Down below, the Omega Shield sensors completely failed to register a threat. There were no supersonic kinetic ballistics approaching. There were no thermal laser spikes to deflect. There was only the slow, crushing, freezing weight of the native environment. The highly advanced shield remained completely passive as the first 10,000 tons of freezing snow gently pressed against the violet energy barrier, slowly sliding right through the permeable light filter. Then came 100,000 tons, then 1,000,000. The alien barrier was utterly defenseless against the slow-moving geology. The freezing white mass poured directly into the enclosed base, instantly swallowing the pristine Kelthos landing zone. The massive volume of absolute zero cold violently slammed into the thermal exhaust vents of the alien mothership. The ship's highly advanced safety protocols screamed in mechanical terror. To prevent a catastrophic thermal inversion from the sudden drop in temperature, the primary reactors initiated an emergency, total system shutdown. The towering violet dome flickered violently, groaned against the immense weight, and completely died. The mighty Kelthos mining fleet was instantly buried beneath 15 meters of heavily compacted, solid ice. The entire invasion force was instantly paralyzed, completely entombed by the sheer fury of a Wyoming winter. Exactly 3 hours later, Fleet Commander Zylock sat trembling violently in his pitch-black command deck. The temperature inside the buried ship had plummeted to fatal levels. His breath crystallized in the freezing dark air. His grand planetary conquest had been completely crushed without the natives firing a single effective shot. Defeated, entirely humiliated, and freezing to death. Zylock crawled painfully over to the emergency backup console. He frantically transmitted an unconditional surrender signal directly to his orbital fleet, begging desperately for an immediate evacuation from what he officially classified as the White Death Planet. By the time the official federal government transport helicopters finally touched down in the valley later that afternoon, the intergalactic crisis was entirely over. Heavily armed federal agents poured out of the choppers, expecting to walk into a massive, highly radioactive war zone. Instead, They found Sheriff Davis and Bodie Beck casually driving bright yellow county snowplows, carefully digging shivering, pathetic alien soldiers out of the deep snowbanks. The local deputies were thoroughly patting down the terrifying cosmic invaders, confiscating their frozen energy weapons, and zip-tying their scaly wrists tightly to the rusty tailgates of heavy-duty pickup trucks. When a completely stunned federal commander asked what the official charges were, Sheriff Davis just tipped his wide-brimmed hat and adjusted his heavy jacket. Hunting without a valid state permit, reckless discharge of an energy weapon, and aggressively littering on protected public land. We take environmental conservation very seriously around here, son. Months later, human intelligence agencies intercepted and translated the official after-action report Xyloc had sent back to the Kelthos Empire. The warning was absolute and deeply fearful. Do not ever trust optical or thermal data at these specific planetary coordinates. The most dangerous weapons these native humans possess are not their kinetic firearms or explosive projectiles. Their true power is the terrifying, deadly intellect of towering men wearing plaid wool garments, drinking boiling black liquid, and their absolute ability to effortlessly turn their entire hostile ecosystem into a weapon of mass destruction. But Bodie Beck did not care about intergalactic military reports or classified government secrets. Exactly 4 days after the invasion, on a perfectly still, beautifully quiet Tuesday morning, Bodie hiked back up to his favorite strategic ridge. He sat down on a familiar rock, breathing in the crisp, freezing mountain air. He reached into his heavy pack and pulled out his trusty metal thermos. It was now permanently wrapped in a highly polished, heavily dented piece of thermal insulating alien hull armor he had scavenged from the wreckage. He unscrewed the cap, took a long, satisfying sip of scalding hot black coffee, and smiled. The woods were finally quiet again. It was just him, the freezing wind, and the perfect, undisturbed silence of true hunting season. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for listening to today's story. We would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? If you enjoyed this story and want to help us out, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the donation link in the video description or the pinned comment below. Your kindness helps us pay our hard-working staff so they can feed their families and keep creating more amazing stories just for you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next adventure.